Greetings, class. So you just listened to a video from the Ethics Unwrapped series that talked about kind of the situations where there might be ethical questions and sometimes you don't recognize that. So I'd like you to go to the textbook and take a look at the Wells Fargo ban on fraudulent company practices. That was a scandal a couple of years ago, and it still remains unresolved. So, what ethical lessons can be drawn from the scandal involving the actions of Wells Fargo's employees and their managers and supervisors? Look at that and think about it. What I'm going to do now is to talk about different informal approaches to ethical dilemmas. There are in the book a lot of approaches that are discussed, and I'll discuss some of those too. So, a couple of the informal approaches. One is the golden rule. That's a test that says the decision maker should do unto others as he or she would have others do unto him or her. This is sort of a generally accepted principle in Judeo-Christian religions. The question sometimes is, how do you decide what you would want done unto you? It's a good informal test, but it doesn't provide all the answers. Another test is what's called the front page test. That front page test is the question, is this a decision or a course of action that a person would feel comfortable seeing as the lead story on the front page of a local or national newspaper? So, think about it. How would you feel about a decision that you've made at the workplace, which is what we're focusing on now, if that was a front page headline? Would you want that to be? Would you want to have to explain it to others? Again, that's an informal approach, and it doesn't give you all the answers, but at least it should help you stop and think about, do I really want this to be a decision that everyone knows about? That's the point of this informal test. There are other more formal approaches to ethics, and they're divided into consequential and non-consequential theories. The idea being that when you look at an ethical dilemma, you look at what the consequences of that decision might be. So you judge the ethics of an action by the consequences of that action. And that's what we have here on the far left circle. In the middle of this slide, we have several popular consequential ethical theories. So we're going to go through those and go through them somewhat quickly. You really should look in the book, and also you can look on the internet to find other more detailed explanations of these theories. So one is ethical egoism. It's a prescriptive theory that says that the proper goal of all people is their own self-interest. We kind of distinguish that from a psychological egoism, but the idea is the individual, or in our case, the company, takes a look at whether something's ethical or not by whether it maximizes the pure profit of the business. And that's what's in the rectangle on the right side of the slide. So the focus, for example, for a business is pure profit maximization. Now, there can be other less, or what we call enlightened self-interest, where although the ultimate goal is profit maximization, it may be examined from a more long-term perspective, in that profit maximization over the long term might include looking at the impact of that decision on others. A second ethical theory that's consequential is what's called a feminist ethical theory. It's not really specifically discussed in the book, but I just want you to be aware of it. It's also called the ethics of caring, which indicates that a particular attention should be paid to the effect of decisions on individuals, especially those individuals in a close relationship with the decision maker. So that an example of that might be looking at the ethics to determine how that would affect your family or your local community. That's, again, the ethics of feminism. And I strongly suggest you take a look at, just go on the internet and find credible websites that discuss this in more detail and how that might apply. But you're still looking at consequences. Utilitarianism is often the common theory that's presented in business context. So under utilitarianism, the whether an action is ethical or not depends on whether that conduct is the one that produces the greatest good or the least net harm for the greatest number. Thus, that focuses on the interests of the group instead of the individual, as an egoist would do. So again, when we look at ethical egoism, it's like the business looking at what's in that particular business's best interest. In utilitarianism, the framework is broader. What would work on the best interests of the group as a whole? One of the issues with the utilitarianism is what exactly is the group? Now, obviously, the group is more than just the business, but is the group the industry? Is the group the local community? Is the group the country? Is the group the world? So utilitarianism is often quoted as a basis or explained as a basis for making business decisions, but one of the struggles is figuring out who that group would be. We won't have time to really discuss this in detail, but again, get on the internet and take a look at it to see what it means, because the framework of who the group is makes a big difference on how the analysis occurs. You'll see in the rectangle on the right, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. I am a Star Trek fan, and this is a quote from Mr. Spock in Star Trek, in the second movie, where the spaceship is being is not able to function because there's a leak of radiation. And so what Mr. Spock does is he goes into the area where the radiation is and he repairs it and dies from the radiation. The quote then comes in the context of the captain of the ship, the spaceship, Captain Kirk, comes to Spock and says, why? Why would you do that? And Spock's response is, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. So he's willing to sacrifice himself to save the ship, and the spaceship does get saved. Luckily, though, in the next Star Trek movie, Mr. Spock is revived. So he only died temporarily. So that's just kind of a brief explanation of the ethical theories that are consequential theories. There are also non-consequential ethical theories. And those principles or theories tend to focus on the concept of duty rather than the results of the action. So non-consequential ethical theories are more rule-based, the rule being you have to be generous, you have to be kind, you have to follow those principles, you have to be a good parent, etc. And you follow those principles regardless of what the consequences are. So Immanuel Kant is one of the ethical theorists who is a non-consequential theorist. He said that there are certain universal moral standards that exist without regard to the circumstances of the moment or the values of a particular society. And you might think about those theories in the context of the Ethics Unwrapped video that you just watched. Each person should therefore act in a way that his or her actions could become universal law, and adherence to those rules are imperative. So if you believe that you are a generous person, then you're a generous person in every context, in every situation, and that's how you analyze whether you're acting ethically or not. If loyalty is a universal moral standard and you want other people to act more loyally, then that loyalty trumps everything else. It doesn't matter what the consequences of that loyalty might be. A second ethical theory is John Rawls and his veil of ignorance. That's a theory that suggests that the rules of ethical behavior are created by persons who ignore their own characteristics such as gender, race, ethnicity, and or religion, and create ethical principles based on that. So the idea is that you will act ethically if you act in accordance with a principle that doesn't acknowledge what your own personal characteristics are. So, for example, you would be just or fair if you act in a way that is not dependent on what your own characteristics are. So the wealthy, for example, would be treated the same as the non-wealthy because you don't know where you're going to fit in that system. So you want to make sure that you follow those ethical principles. We also have the third ethical theory, which is virtue ethics. Again, it's non-consequentialist theory. And virtue ethics are attitude, dispositions, or character traits that focus on who or what you want to be, not the rules or principles per se. They focus on our character, the certain ideals we should try to accomplish, for example, excellence, dedication to the common good, honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, etc. So it focuses on how you think you are. And how you think you are, or what type of person you think you are, that determines whether you act ethically or not. So if I think I'm an honest person, then I don't focus on what the consequences of that honesty are. If you ask me a question, I'm going to give you an honest answer, period, regardless of what the consequences are. So those are examples of ethical theories that are non-consequential. The last thing I wanted to take a look at in this section is a theory for ethical decision making. And this is based on those four characteristics or four-part analysis that you have in the book. I just have a couple of different approaches to that. So one of the things you look at is the law and the regulations, how they affect the business. Again, it's part of your ethical decision making, but part of it is often, is this legal or not? You also look at short-term versus long-term public relations impact of any of the decisions on the society as well as the organization. So kind of a utilitarian, but taking the consequence idea and looking at it short and long term to see what those consequences might be. A third aspect of it is the safety risks for constituent groups, and I identify some of those constituent groups. The public, consumers, employees are all constituent groups that you look at. Is this safe, or what the safety risks are of the decision that the business is making? And then the other part is the financial impact of any decisions on society and on the organization. Note that I put the financial risks and the financial impact last in this list. I think the book also puts it last, but you'll have to take a look at it for sure. But I specifically want it to be a last characteristic, because what we tend to do is we tend to immediately say, well, how much will this cost financially, without looking at how much it would cost in other ways, in public relations and safety, and whether you violated the law or not. And it's important, if you're trying to act ethically, that the financial impact should really be last rather than first. So that's where we are at this point.